Julian Thorne watched the monitor, his expression a mask of cold fury. He had been told the nanny was incompetent, a flighty girl unfit to care for a child, a temporary placeholder until someone more suitable could be found. He had been told she was sullen, uncommunicative, and barely tolerated the boy. What he was witnessing was something else entirely. It was a moment of quiet, profound grace that would unravel a tapestry of lies and bring an empire of arrogance to its knees. Within a week, the carefully constructed world of Richard and Eleanor Croft would shatter, not with a bang, but with the devastating impact of a softly spoken truth. Before we see what Julian saw, and before the world of the Croft family is turned upside down, I want to thank you for joining us. If you enjoy stories where decency triumphs over disdain, and where hidden strength is finally revealed, consider liking this story and subscribing to the channel for more narratives that resonate. We love knowing where our stories travel, so please let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Now, let us return to the quiet storm brewing in that sunlit room, where a young woman named Ilara Vance had no idea she was being watched, and no idea that her simple act of kindness was about to change everything. It had begun 3 months prior, on a crisp autumn morning that felt full of brittle promises. Ilara stood before the imposing steel and glass facade of the modernist mansion, a structure of such aggressive minimalism it felt more like a corporate headquarters than a home. It was a rental, a temporary perch for the Crofts while their own palatial estate underwent a year-long renovation. The house belonged to a reclusive tech billionaire, a man they had never met, but whose wealth they openly admired and envied. Ilara clutched the strap of her simple canvas bag, inside of which lay a worn, leather-bound journal. To any observer, she was just another applicant, nervous and unassuming. But her calmness was not born of naivete. It was the practiced stillness of a strategist observing the board before making the first move. Her own life, once a soaring architectural design of ambition and success, had been put on hold. Her father, a brilliant historian who had taught her to see the stories in stones and structures, was fighting a battle that required all her focus and a flexibility her high-powered career as a lead landscape architect could not afford. She needed something simple, something that paid the bills without demanding her soul. A quiet harbor while she navigated the storm of her father's illness. A nanny position for a wealthy family seemed like the perfect, anonymous solution. Eleanor Croft had sized her up in seconds. Her eyes, the color of winter ice, swept over Ilara's simple dark trousers, her soft cotton blouse, and her practical, flat shoes. The assessment was swift and dismissive. This was not a peer. This was staff. Ilara Vance, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a practiced, bored sort of authority. She didn't offer a hand. Your resume is sparse. I've included the relevant experience, Ilara replied, her tone even and calm. She had deliberately created a resume for this purpose, highlighting summer camp counseling from her teens and babysitting gigs from college. She had omitted the master's degree from a prestigious university, the industry awards, the multi-million-dollar park projects she had designed and overseen. Right, Eleanor sniffed, waving a dismissive hand. Well, the agency seems to think you're capable of looking after a 6-year-old. His name is Leo. He's quiet. Your duties are simple. Keep him occupied, prepare his meals, the list is on the counter, and stay out of the way. We entertain frequently. Discretion is paramount. The interview was less a conversation and more a list of decrees. Ilara was shown her room, a small, sterile space in a separate wing of the house, a world away from the sprawling, art-filled living areas. It was clear her existence was meant to be parallel to, but never intersecting with, the lives of her employers. Richard Croft had made a brief appearance, a man who seemed like a faded photograph of a once vibrant person. He had a kind but weary smile, a handshake that was surprisingly gentle, and an inability to meet his wife's gaze for more than a second. He was the silent enabler, the soft cushion that absorbed the impact of his wife's sharp edges, protecting her from the consequences of her own cruelty. He saw Ilara, truly saw her for a moment, and a flicker of unease crossed his face, as if he sensed a dissonance between the person standing before him and the role she was about to play. Then Eleanor spoke, and the flicker was gone, replaced by a mask of marital compliance. "Richard, darling, don't bother the girl. She has a lot to learn about how we run things here." Ilara's first encounter with Leo was in the garden. The space was a landscape architect's nightmare, a vast, manicured lawn with rigidly geometric flower beds and exotic trees that were entirely unsuited to the local climate. It was a statement of wealth, not a place of peace. Leo was sitting on a stone bench, looking at a ladybug on his finger. He was a small, solemn child, with his father's gentle eyes and an aura of profound loneliness. "Hello, Leo," Ilara said softly, approaching him not as an authority figure, but as a fellow explorer in this strange, sterile world. "My name is Ilara. That's a beautiful ladybug." Leo looked up, his expression guarded. He was used to nannies who treated him like a task on a checklist. "My mother says they're pests." "Well," Ilara said, sitting beside him, careful to leave a respectful distance, "sometimes people see pests, and sometimes people see tiny, beautiful beetles that help gardens by eating the real pests. It all depends on how you choose to look." For the first time that day, the boy smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was genuine. In that moment, Ilara knew that this job would be more complicated than she had anticipated. She wasn't just here to pass the time. She was here to stand guard over a small, flickering flame of childhood wonder that his parents were actively, if unconsciously, trying to extinguish with their cold, materialist winds. She would be his silent guardian, a role she accepted with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else in her life. She opened her canvas bag and took out her leather journal, placing it on her lap. It was a symbolic anchor, a reminder of who she was, even in a place designed to make her feel like a nobody. The Crofts saw a diary. She felt the weight of blueprints, of dreams, of a world she knew how to build. The first major humiliation came 2 weeks into her employment. Eleanor was hosting a luncheon for a circle of women who were less friends and more a cooperative of social climbers, their bonds forged in competition and sealed with gossip. They sat on the sprawling terrace overlooking the sterile garden, their laughter sharp and brittle as breaking glass. Ilara was instructed to serve the chilled cucumber soup, a task she performed with quiet efficiency. She moved around the table, her presence as unobtrusive as she could make it, but Eleanor seemed to delight in making her a part of the day's entertainment. "You simply cannot find good help anymore," Eleanor announced to the table, loud enough for Ilara to hear clearly as she refilled a water glass. "They're either entirely incompetent or they have pretensions. It's exhausting." A woman named Beatrice, adorned in diamonds that glittered cruelly in the midday sun, looked Ilara up and down. "Where did you find this one, Eleanor?" "She's very plain." "An agency," Eleanor sighed dramatically. "A temporary measure. Our last one tried to bond with Leo. Can you imagine? I told her, your job is to supervise him, not to psychoanalyze him." The women tittered. Ilara's hand did not shake as she poured the water. Her face remained a placid mask. Inside, however, she was not feeling hurt or anger. She was cataloging. It was a habit from her professional life. When a client was difficult, she would dispassionately note their objections, their irrational demands, their personality flaws, not as insults, but as data points. These data points would then inform the strategy for managing them. Eleanor Croft and her friends were a uniquely challenging project. Ilara moved back toward the kitchen, but Eleanor's voice stopped her. "Ilara, wait." Ilara turned. "Yes, Mrs. Croft?" "Beatrice was just asking what your plans are, your ambitions. I told her I have no idea. You're rather a closed book." The question was framed as curiosity, but it was a trap. a public dissection disguised as small talk. Ilara met her gaze. My ambitions right now are to ensure Leo is safe and well cared for, and to do my job to the best of my ability. The answer was perfect. It was deferential, professional, and utterly unassailable. It gave them nothing to mock, nothing to latch on to. Eleanor's smile tightened. She had expected a flustered, embarrassed confession of wanting to be an actress or a writer, something her friends could have a good laugh about later. How very noble, Beatrice said, her tone making the word sound like an insult. And what did you do before you decided to dedicate yourself to the well-being of other people's children? Ilara paused for a fraction of a second. I worked in design, she said, the statement both perfectly true and perfectly misleading. Oh, wonderful, chirped another woman, Camilla. Fashion? Interiors? My cousin does interiors, perhaps I know your work. No, Ilara said calmly. It was a small, technical firm. You wouldn't have heard of it. The subject was dropped, the women bored by her lack of gossipy potential. But as Ilara returned to the kitchen, she felt Richard Croft's eyes on her. He had been silent throughout the exchange, staring into his soup as if it held the secrets of the universe. When their eyes met, she saw a flash of something akin to shame in his. He knew what his wife was doing was wrong, cruel, but he said nothing. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage, and he had long ago forgotten how to even rattle the bars. His silence was its own form of cruelty, a passive endorsement of his wife's viciousness. Ilara added it to her mental file, the silent enabler, a crucial component of the structure. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and a tense silence had fallen over the house, Ilara sat in her small white room. She had her laptop open, but she wasn't scrolling through social media or watching movies. On the screen was a complex, multi-layered digital blueprint. It was the Helios Tower project, a revolutionary new skyscraper in Dubai that was set to be a marvel of sustainable architecture. Her firm had won the contract, but the lead designer for the sprawling ground-level public spaces and integrated parkland was officially on a leave of absence. That lead designer was her. She was still consulting, working late at night when the Crofts were asleep, sending notes and revisions to her trusted deputy. The project was her lifeline to her real self. She glanced at the leather journal on her bedside table. Earlier, Eleanor had seen her writing in it and had made a snide comment. Keeping a diary of all your little thoughts and feelings? How quaint. Ilara hadn't corrected her. Let them think it was a diary. Let them think she was simple. Their assumptions were the foundation of their blindness, and their blindness would be the foundation of her strategy. She sketched a new concept for the tower's water reclamation system, her pen moving with practiced confidence. The Crofts thought she was designing a child's schedule. She was designing a city's future. The dramatic irony was a shield, protecting her from the sting of their condescension. She was not their victim. She was an observer, a strategist in deep cover, waiting for the right moment to reveal the true design. The weeks bled into one another, each one marked by a fresh, casual cruelty from Eleanor and a corresponding act of quiet defiance from Ilara. The defiance was never overt. It was in the way she nurtured Leo's burgeoning curiosity, a direct counter-programming to his mother's attempts to mold him into a miniature status symbol. Eleanor had enrolled Leo in fencing and Mandarin classes, not because he showed any interest, but because they were the right activities for a child of his station. It builds character and looks excellent on an application for boarding school later, she'd explained, as if her 6-year-old was already a product to be marketed. Leo hated the classes. He would return sullen and frustrated, the joy leached from his small face. Ilara, in the quiet hours of the afternoon, would undo the damage. She discovered his fascination with the natural world, a fascination his mother dismissed as dirty. They started a small, hidden garden in a forgotten corner of the vast property, behind a row of overgrown rhododendrons. It was their secret world. Ilara, using the deep knowledge from her profession, taught him about companion planting, about the symbiotic relationship between bees and flowers, about the delicate architecture of a spider's web. Everything has a structure, Leo, she explained one afternoon, showing him how the veins on a leaf mirrored the branches of a tree. Even things that look wild and messy, there's a plan, a purpose. You just have to be patient enough to see it. She was talking about plants, but she was also talking about life. She was teaching him resilience, showing him that strength wasn't about the sharp lunge of a fencer's foil, but about the slow, persistent growth of a root system, unseen beneath the surface. Eleanor, of course, noticed the change in her son, but misinterpreted it completely. Leo seems more distracted lately, she complained to Richard over dinner. The table was a football field of polished mahogany, their voices echoing in the cavernous dining room. Ilara was in the kitchen, plating their food, but she could hear every word. I think it's the nanny. She's too soft with him. He needs more discipline, not less. He seems happier, Eleanor, Richard ventured, a rare moment of dissent. Happy? She scoffed. Happiness is for the unambitious. He needs to be prepared. This world doesn't reward happy. It rewards successful. The next day, Eleanor confronted Ilara in the kitchen. She held up a pair of Leo's trousers, stained with dirt at the knees. What is this? She demanded, her voice sharp. I pay you to look after my son, not to encourage him to roll around in the mud like a common street child. We were gardening, Mrs. Croft, Ilara replied, her voice even. Leo has been learning about ecosystems. Ecosystems? Eleanor's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. He's 6. He needs to be learning his Mandarin verb conjugations, not digging for worms. Your job description does not include peasant hobbies. Is that clear? From now on, his afternoons are to be spent indoors, reviewing his lessons. I won't have your simple-minded influence undoing all the expensive advantages we are trying to give him. It was a direct attack, not just on her methods, but on her very being. The implication was clear. You are simple, you are common, and your influence is a contamination. Ilara felt a familiar cold calm settle over her. She looked at Eleanor, at the desperate insecurity churning behind the woman's icy eyes, the fear that her son might not reflect her own curated image of perfection. I understand your instructions, Mrs. Croft, Ilara said. The words were compliant, but her gaze was not. It was a clear, steady look of assessment, and it unnerved Eleanor more than any argument could have. The woman felt a prickle of discomfort, a momentary feeling of being seen and found wanting. She shook it off, attributing it to the girl's insolence. Good, Eleanor snapped, throwing the trousers onto a counter. Just remember your place. That night, the conflict escalated. The Crofts were hosting a dinner party for Richard's business partners. It was a crucial evening. A major deal was on the line, one that depended on Richard's reputation as a stable, decisive leader. Eleanor was a whirlwind of tense energy, barking orders at the catering staff and snapping at her husband. Leo, overwhelmed by the noise and the influx of strangers, had a nightmare. He woke up screaming. Ilara, hearing him from her room, was by his side in an instant, long before his parents even registered the sound from their downstairs soiree. She found him sitting bolt upright in bed, his small body trembling, tears streaming down his face. It was the monster, he whispered, clutching her arm. The shadow monster. Eleanor appeared at the doorway, her face a thundercloud. She was wearing a silk gown that shimmered under the hall lights, a perfect hostess dragged away from her duties. What is all this noise? She hissed. Leo, stop this nonsense at once. There are no such things as monsters. You're being a baby. Her words were like stones, hard and bruising. Leo flinched and began to cry harder, a desperate, hiccuping sob. He's frightened, Ilara said softly, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. He's being manipulative, Eleanor retorted. He knows we have important guests. Go back to sleep, Leo. Now. She turned to leave, her duty as a mother fulfilled with a curt dismissal. Richard was standing behind her in the hallway. He looked from his terrified son to his furious wife, his face a portrait of helpless indecision. He opened his mouth as if to say something, to offer a word of comfort, but then he caught Eleanor's glare. He shut his mouth. He looked at Alara, a silent, pathetic plea in his eyes, asking her to fix the mess. Then he turned and followed his wife back down the stairs. Ilara's heart didn't break for herself, but for the little boy who had just learned that his fear was an inconvenience to his parents. She sat on the edge of his bed and pulled the covers up around him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she reached for a tool from her own world. "You know how we build things in the garden, Leo?" she asked gently. "How we make strong walls for the tomato plants so they can grow tall?" Leo nodded, his sobs subsiding into sniffles. "We can do the same thing in your mind," she said. "Your mind is like a big, amazing garden. Sometimes scary thoughts, like that shadow monster, try to creep in like weeds. But we can build a fortress inside your mind, a safe place. Let's design it right now." She began to speak in a low, soothing voice, her language shifting from that of a nanny to that of an architect. She described the fortress in vivid detail. Walls made of his favorite memories, a gate guarded by his favorite superhero, a tower made of his happiest dreams where he could look out and see that the shadows were just ordinary things in the dark. She was giving him a structure for his courage, a blueprint for his own inner strength. Slowly, the tension left his body. His breathing deepened. He was asleep, his hands still loosely holding hers. Ilara sat there for a long time, the quiet hum of the party downstairs a distant, irrelevant noise. She looked at the peaceful face of the child and felt a surge of protective anger so fierce it surprised her. The Crofts weren't just neglectful. They were actively demolishing their own son's spirit. They saw him as an accessory, a reflection of their status. They had no idea that their greatest treasure was not the art on their walls or the money in their bank, but the small boy sleeping in this room, and they were failing him in every conceivable way. Unseen, unheard, a tiny camera lens embedded in the smoke detector on the ceiling captured the entire scene. Miles away, in a secure monitoring room on his own vast, secluded estate, Julian Thorne, the reclusive billionaire who owned the house, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. He had been alerted by his security system to a sound anomaly in the child's room. He had listened to Eleanor's harsh dismissal and Richard's weak retreat. He had expected to see the nanny follow suit, to perhaps pat the boy on the back and leave. He had not expected to witness an act of profound, intelligent compassion. He had not expected to hear the language of design and architecture used as a balm for a child's fear. He rewound the footage, listening again. "Your mind is like a big, amazing garden. Let's design it right now." Julian Thorne was a man who understood structure. His entire empire was built on it, on seeing the underlying patterns and systems that others missed. What he had just seen was not the action of a simple-minded girl. It was the work of a sophisticated, empathetic, and highly intelligent mind. The Crofts had been petitioning him for months, desperate to buy the magnificent property they were renting. They had sent him gifts, written fawning letters, and in their latest correspondence, they had mentioned their nanny problem, subtly painting Ilara as unstable and untrustworthy, a problem they would soon be rectifying. They thought it would make them seem discerning. Julian looked from the screen showing the sleeping child to another monitor displaying a file he had just pulled up. It was the rental application for the Crofts, and attached to it, for security vetting, were the full, unredacted background checks on all long-term staff. He clicked open the file for Ilara Vance. He read about the master's degree in landscape architecture. He saw the list of awards, the prestigious International Design Prize, the Green Planet Award for Sustainable Building. He saw her former title, lead architect at a top-tier global firm. He cross-referenced the name with a business journal database, and saw her face attached to articles about the Helios Tower. A slow, cold anger began to build in him. The Crofts weren't just arrogant fools. They were liars. They were sitting in his house, a house he had designed as a sanctuary of peace and creative energy, and they were poisoning it with their pettiness and cruelty. And they were doing it to a woman who was, in her own field, a giant, a creator, a builder of worlds. A woman who was hiding her light, not out of shame, but for a reason he could only guess was deeply personal and profound. And they were too blind, too consumed by their own pathetic status anxiety, to see the star that was quietly shining in their midst. He picked up his phone. "Get me everything you can on the current state of Croft Enterprises," he said to his chief of staff, "and cancel my appointments for the rest of the week. I believe I need to pay a visit to my tenants." The storm was no longer quiet. It had a name, and it was heading directly for the House of Croft. The week that followed was the quiet before the deluge. Ilara, unaware of the silent allies she had gained, continued her work. She abided by Eleanor's new rules, keeping Leo indoors during the afternoons, but she turned his lessons into games of structural engineering, using blocks to teach him about load-bearing walls and cantilevers. She was still building his fortress, just with different materials. Eleanor, meanwhile, was becoming more and more agitated. The big deal Richard was working on had hit a snag. The partners were getting cold feet, citing vague concerns about the company's foundational stability. It was a phrase that infuriated Eleanor. Croft Enterprises was a rock, a legacy. This wavering was a sign of disrespect, and it put her in a foul mood that she directed, as always, at the easiest target. The final confrontation was precipitated by something small, almost laughably so: a single, perfect seashell. Leo had found it months ago on a rare family trip to the beach, a trip Eleanor had complained through. He kept it in a small, velvet-lined box, his most prized possession. Eleanor, in a fit of reorganizing mania, decided Leo's room needed to be minimalized. She swept through, discarding toys she deemed too childish and books that weren't on her approved educational list. In her purge, she found the box. "What is this clutter?" she'd asked, holding the shell between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of garbage. "It's my shell," Leo cried, reaching for it. "It's a dead mollusk, Leo. It's unhygienic." And with that, she tossed it into a trash bag filled with discarded Lego sets and stuffed animals. Leo's wail was one of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. Ilara, who was in the hallway, rushed in. She saw the scene. Leo sobbing on the floor, Eleanor standing over him with the trash bag, her face a mask of cold impatience. "What happened?" Ilara asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I am simply cleaning up this pigsty," Eleanor said. "He's having a tantrum over a piece of beach trash." Ilara looked at the boy, whose grief was so palpable it seemed to suck the air from the room. Then she looked at the woman who had caused it. And in that moment, something inside Ilara shifted. The observer became the actor. The period of patient waiting was over. She walked over to the trash bag, reached inside, and retrieved the small velvet box. She knelt and gave it back to Leo, who clutched it to his chest as if it were a lifeline. She then stood up and faced Eleanor Croft. The height difference between them was negligible, but suddenly Ilara seemed to tower over her employer. "You had no right to do that," Ilara said. Her voice was not raised. It was low, calm, and carried the weight of a judge's sentence. Eleanor was so taken aback by this act of open rebellion that for a moment she was speechless. "I am his mother. I am your employer. You will not speak to me that way. You are fired, Ilara. Fired. Pack your things. I want you out of this house in 1 hour." Richard rushed in, drawn by the commotion. "Eleanor, what's going on? For God's sake, the investors are arriving for the signing any minute." This servant dared to question me," Eleanor shrieked. "She's finished. Get her out of here before your partners arrive. I will not have her presence tainting this day. This was it, the moment she had been planning for, though not in the way she had expected. The public stage was set. Fine, Alara said, her composure absolute. I will leave, but first you will apologize to your son. Apologize? Eleanor laughed, a high, hysterical sound. I will do no such thing. You are truly delusional. The doorbell rang, sharp, clear, and final. That will be them, Richard said, his face pale with sweat. He shot Alara a look of pure panic. Please just go, quietly. No, Alara said. I don't think I will. She walked out of Leo's room and stood at the top of the grand floating staircase, a position that gave her a commanding view of the entrance hall. Richard and Eleanor hurried down to greet their guests, but the man standing in the doorway was not the investor they were expecting. He was tall, dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored dark suit, and his face, familiar from countless magazine covers but rarely seen in person, was calm and unreadable. It was Julian Thorne. Eleanor's fury evaporated, instantly replaced by a fawning, sycophantic glee. Mr. Thorne, what a wonderful surprise! We weren't expecting you, but we are absolutely delighted. Richard, flustered, scrambled to her side. Sir, an honor. Please come in. Thank you, Mr. Croft, Julian said, his voice smooth as polished granite. He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the cavernous space before landing on Alara, who stood motionless on the stairs. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I was in the area. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Eleanor gushed. We were just tidying up. In fact, you've arrived at a perfect moment. We were just letting go of our nanny, a rather unfortunate situation, but one must maintain standards. She shot a triumphant, venomous glare up at Alara. She thought Julian's arrival was a godsend, a chance to prove to him how discerning and in control she was. This was the fatal flaw of the arrogant, the belief that the universe always conspires in their favor. Julian's gaze remained on Alara. You're firing Miss Vance? He asked, his tone neutral. Yes, Eleanor said proudly. She has proven to be unsuitable, a lack of judgment, insubordinate. I see, Julian said. He took another step into the room, his presence seeming to fill the entire space. That's interesting, because from my perspective, her judgment appears to be the only sound judgment in this entire house. The statement landed. Simple, devastating, final. Eleanor's smile froze on her face. I don't understand. Let me clarify, Julian said, his voice losing its neutral tone and taking on an edge of cold steel. You have been living in my home for 6 months, a home that has a state-of-the-art security system, a system that I, as the owner, have access to. I am alerted to disturbances, crying children, for instance. Richard Croft went white. He looked as though he might faint. Eleanor stared, her mind refusing to process the implications. I am aware of the incident a week ago, Mrs. Croft, Julian continued, his voice a low, cutting murmur that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. I heard you dismiss your son's fears. I saw your husband stand by and do nothing. And then I saw this young woman, Miss Vance, do what you were unwilling or unable to do. Comfort a terrified child. But she didn't just comfort him. She empowered him. She used concepts of design and structure to help him build a fortress in his own mind. It was an act of breathtaking intelligence and compassion. He took a step closer to Eleanor, who instinctively recoiled. You, in your correspondence with me, described her as unstable and simple. I have a different assessment. I have also reviewed her credentials, the ones she was too dignified to throw in your face, despite months of your condescending and frankly pathetic abuse. He turned his head slightly, addressing the stunned couple but also the silent, listening house. Are you aware that the simple girl you hired as a nanny is Alara Vance? the lead architect for the Helios Towers landscape project, winner of the International Design Prize, a woman whose professional accomplishments eclipse anything either of you have ever achieved in your entire lives? Silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the sound of Richard Croft making a small, choking noise. Eleanor's face had crumpled. The mask of arrogant superiority had shattered, revealing the terrified, insecure woman beneath. All the blood had drained from her face. She took this job, a job so far beneath her, for personal reasons that are none of your business, Julian went on, his voice relentless. She offered you her service, and in return, you offered her your contempt. You mocked her clothes, her supposed lack of ambition, her very character. You saw a servant to look down upon. Because your own egos are so fragile, you need to diminish others to feel large. This was the moral mirror. He was reflecting their own ugliness back at them, and they could not look away. And today, Julian said, his voice dropping even lower, today you tried to fire her. For what? For defending your son from your own casual cruelty. For retrieving a seashell that you, in an act of petty tyranny, threw in the trash. He looked up the stairs at Alara, who had not moved. Her expression was calm, her dignity a stark contrast to the unraveling couple below. Miss Vance, he said, his voice now respectful, I believe you are leaving. Please don't. In fact, I would ask you to stay, as my guest. He then turned his devastatingly calm gaze back to the Crofts. You, however, will be leaving. Your lease is hereby terminated. My lawyers will be in touch regarding the breach of the character clause. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Character clause? Richard stammered, finding his voice at last. There's no character clause. Oh, but there is, Julian said with a thin, cold smile. It's a special clause I include in all my personal property agreements. I do not suffer fools, and I certainly do not allow bullies to reside in my home. You have demonstrated a profound lack of character, of decency, of basic human empathy. You are, in short, unsuitable tenants. He used Eleanor's own word against her. It was a verbal chess match, and he had just declared checkmate. Eleanor finally broke. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, ugly sound of utter defeat. Please, she whispered, the word pathetic and stripped of all its former power. My husband's business, our reputation, this will ruin us. Your reputation? Julian's voice was laced with ice. Your reputation was a facade, built on a foundation of arrogance and propped up by the silence of people you intimidated. True reputations are built on integrity, something you know nothing about. You have not been ruined. You have been revealed. He walked past them, ascending the stairs to where Alara stood. He stopped a few steps below her, looking up at her with an expression of deep respect. Miss Vance, he said quietly, so only she could hear. I am profoundly sorry for what you have endured in my house. I should have intervened sooner. You intervened at exactly the right time, Alara replied, her voice steady. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Julian, he corrected her gently. I believe we may have much to discuss. I've been following the Helios project. Your work is revolutionary. Down below, the Crofts stood frozen, two statues in a museum of their own making, their world collapsing around them in silent, slow motion. The guests who were meant to be arriving for the signing would find the deal dead. The social circle that orbited them would scatter like dust. The life they had so carefully and so cruelly constructed was over. The reversal of fortune was absolute. The underestimated nanny was now the honored guest. The arrogant elite were now the dispossessed. And in the quiet of his room, a little boy clutched a seashell, oblivious to the drama, but for the first time, truly safe. The immediate aftermath was a study in disintegration. The authoritative pronouncement from Julian Thorne hung in the air of the grand foyer, sucking all the oxygen out of the Crofts' world. For a few long seconds, no one moved. It was as if Julian's words had physically frozen them in place. Eleanor was the first to break. Her collapse was not graceful. It was a jagged, ugly crumbling. The carefully constructed facade of the unassailable society queen dissolved into the raw panic of a woman who had just lost everything that defined her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "You can't. We have a contract. We have rights." Julian, who had been speaking quietly with Alara on the stairs, turned his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet authority was more potent than any shout. "Your rights, Mrs. Croft, ended the moment you decided that human decency was optional. My legal team is exceptionally thorough. You will find the character clause on page 17, subsection C, the penalty for which is immediate termination of the lease and, should I choose to pursue it, damages for misrepresentation and endangering the well-being of a minor in my home." Richard flinched as if struck. The mention of Leo, the son he had failed to protect, was a blow he could not parry. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in years, the fog of compliance in his eyes cleared, replaced by a spark of raw, undiluted fury. "This is your fault, Eleanor," he hissed, his voice trembling with a decade of repressed resentment. "All of it. Your pride, your cruelty. I told you to be careful. I told you that you were pushing too hard." "My fault?" Eleanor shrieked, spinning to face him. Her panic had found a target. "You stood there. You let me. You never once stood up to me, not for our son, not for anyone. You are weak, Richard. A coward who hid behind my strength." "That wasn't strength, Eleanor," he shot back, his voice rising in volume and conviction. "It was poison. You poisoned everything you touched. Our marriage, our son, our life. You were so obsessed with appearances, with what people thought, that you forgot to be a person." They were tearing each other apart, right there in the gleaming, minimalist foyer, their ugly truths echoing in the cavernous space. It was the dramatic implosion that had been building for years, finally detonated by the calm, immovable object that was Julian Thorne. Ilara and Julian watched for a moment from the stairs. There was no triumph in Ilara's expression, only a quiet, weary sadness. She had not wanted this public evisceration. She had only wanted to protect a child. This was merely the inevitable structural failure of a poorly built foundation. Julian gestured for her to precede him up the stairs, away from the toxic fallout below. "There is a private study on the second floor," he said, his voice a calm island in the storm of the Crofts' recriminations. "We can talk there. I've taken the liberty of having my staff arrange for your belongings to be moved to a guest suite, a proper one." As they walked away, Eleanor's desperate voice followed them. "Wait, please, Mr. Thorne. Think of our son. What will happen to Leo?" It was a last desperate gambit, using the child she had neglected as a human shield. Julian paused at the top of the landing and looked down. "I am thinking of your son, Mrs. Croft," he said, his voice cold and final. "And I think the best thing for him right now is to be removed from your influence. My offer for Miss Vance to stay here as my guest extends to Leo, for as long as is necessary, until more suitable long-term arrangements can be made. My family attorneys will be in touch. Now I suggest you begin packing." He turned and continued down the hall, leaving the Crofts to the wreckage of their lives. The study was the polar opposite of the rest of the house. Where the main rooms were cold and stark, this room was warm and inviting. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were filled with worn volumes. The furniture was comfortable leather, and a fire crackled in a stone hearth. It was the heart of the home, a place of genuine thought and peace. "Please, sit," Julian said, gesturing to an armchair. "Can I get you anything? Water? Tea?" "I'm fine, thank you," Ilara said, though she sat down feeling the tension of the last few months finally begin to drain from her. Julian sat opposite her, not as a billionaire interrogating a nanny, but as one professional speaking to another. "First, let me say again how impressed I am, Miss Vance. Not just by your work, which I was already familiar with, but by your character. The patience and dignity you've shown under extreme provocation is remarkable. I was just trying to do the job I was hired for, she said simply, and to look out for Leo. You did more than that, he countered. You provided a sanctuary for him. The Crofts saw a house. You saw a home. You saw the garden that could be, not just the sterile plot that was. He leaned forward, his interest genuine. Your father, the historian, your leave of absence. The file was sparse on details. Ilara found herself surprisingly wanting to tell him. The pressure of holding her secret life so tightly for so long was immense. My father has a rare degenerative neurological condition. The prognosis was poor. I needed to be with him, to manage his care. My career, it was all-consuming. I couldn't do both, so I chose him. I needed an income, but something without the mental overhead, something that would allow me to be on call for him at a moment's notice. This seemed simple. She gave a small, wry smile. Nothing is ever simple, Julian said, nodding in understanding. How is he now? Stabilizing, actually, she said, a genuine warmth filling her voice. We found a specialist, a new treatment protocol. The last few weeks have been very promising. The reason I was finally pushed to react today was because I know I don't need this job much longer. My father is getting better. I can go back to my life soon. That is wonderful news, Julian said, and he meant it. Which brings me to my next point. I didn't just come here to evict the Crofts. I came here to meet you. The Helios project is a masterpiece of design, but I've always felt the corporate plaza felt disconnected. Your work on the integrated parkland is the soul of that project. It's what will make it a living structure, not just a glass monument. He paused, his gaze direct. I am the primary investor behind the new Oak Haven Community Project on the West Coast. It's a massive undertaking. A fully sustainable, architecturally integrated town. We are building a world from the ground up. We have a lead architect, a brilliant man, but we have no one to design the soul. The green spaces, the public squares, the schoolyards, the riverwalk. The parts that make a collection of buildings into a community. He leaned back. I want you, Miss Vance. I want your vision. Not as a consultant, as the director of landscape and community architecture. You would have a full team, an unlimited budget, and complete creative freedom. We're not just building structures, we're building a legacy, a better way to live. It aligns perfectly with the principles I see in your work. Ilara was stunned into silence. In the span of an hour, she had gone from being a fired nanny to being offered the project of a lifetime. It was a dizzying reversal. She thought of her journal, filled with sketches and ideas for exactly this kind of project. Utopian concepts she thought would never see the light of day. Mr. Thorne, Julian, she corrected herself. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, he said with a smile. Take your time. Focus on your father. Get your life back in order. The offer stands. When you are ready, my door is open. Downstairs, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. The first of the Crofts had left. The great undoing had begun. Ilara looked around the warm, book-lined study, then at the calm, intelligent man opposite her. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a storm to be weathered, but like an open landscape waiting for a design. The days that followed the Crofts' eviction were a blur of quiet activity and profound change. Julian Thorne was true to his word. He handled the legalities with swift, silent efficiency. His family law division, a team of notoriously sharp but compassionate lawyers, gently intervened on Leo's behalf. It was determined through a series of private evaluations and a surprisingly candid admission of parental failure from a humbled Richard Croft that Leo would temporarily stay with his paternal grandparents, a warm and loving couple who had long been sidelined by Eleanor's snobbery. Ilara played a crucial role in this transition. She spent a week with Leo at the estate, which now felt like a peaceful sanctuary rather than a cold museum. She helped him understand the changes not as a loss, but as a new kind of adventure. They revisited their secret garden together, and she promised to help him design a new one at his grandparents' home. Their farewell was not tearful, but full of a quiet understanding. He gave her the perfect seashell as a parting gift. To remember how to build fortresses, he'd said, parroting her own words back to her with a child's simple wisdom. As for the Crofts, their fall was as swift as it was brutal. The news of their public humiliation and the rescinded deal with the investors spread like wildfire through their elite social and business circles. Julian Thorne had not needed to utter a single public word. The silent withdrawal of his favor was enough. Friends stopped returning calls. Invitations dried up. Business partners, spooked by the display of instability and the sudden catastrophic loss of the Thorne connection, pulled out of pending deals. Croft Enterprises, which had been built on Richard's family legacy but propped up by Eleanor's aggressive social maneuvering, began to hemorrhage money and credibility. They were forced to sell their half-renovated mansion at a massive loss just to cover their debts. They moved into a modest suburban home, a place that felt like a prison to Eleanor. The loss of status was a blow from which Eleanor could not recover. She wandered the small rooms of her new house like a ghost, her designer clothes hanging limply in a closet, a fraction of the size she was used to. The fire in her was gone, replaced by a hollow, bitter resentment. She blamed Richard. She blamed Elara. She blamed Julian Thorne. She blamed everyone but herself. Her moral mirror had been held up to her, and instead of seeing her reflection, she had declared the mirror flawed. Richard, however, underwent a different kind of transformation. Hitting rock bottom had been a strange sort of liberation for him. Freed from the constant pressure of upholding Eleanor's social ambitions, he began to see the world, and himself, clearly for the first time. He started therapy. He spent weekends with his son, not taking him to fencing, but to parks and museums. He was learning, awkwardly and haltingly, how to be a father. Their marriage, a hollow structure for years, finally collapsed completely. Richard filed for divorce, seeking not to punish Eleanor, but to finally free them both from the toxic dynamic they had created. He was starting over, not with wealth or status, but with a genuine attempt at integrity. 3 months after she had walked out of the Thorne estate, Elara stood on a windswept bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The air was salty and clean. Beside her, Julian Thorne unrolled a large architectural drawing on the hood of his car, weighting the corners with small, smooth stones. "This is the site for Oak Haven's community center and library," he said, his voice filled with a quiet passion. "The heart of the town. What do you see?" Elara looked not at the paper, but at the landscape. She saw the way the light hit the golden grasses, the natural curve of the coastline, the gnarled, ancient cypress trees that had withstood a century of storms. Her mind, now free and unburdened, was already at work, sketching invisible lines, seeing structures that honored the land instead of conquering it. Her father was settled comfortably in a state-of-the-art care facility near her new apartment. His condition vastly improved. She was back in her world, a world of creation and possibility. She had taken a month to decompress, to reconnect with her father and herself, and then she had called Julian Thorne. "I see a place where the library's walls are glass, so the readers feel like they are sitting among the trees," she began, her voice gaining confidence and energy. "I see a community center built with the natural contours of the land, not cutting into it. The roof will be a living roof, a garden that connects to the bluff. We'll use reclaimed timber and local stone. It won't be a building we place on the land. It will be a building that grows from it." Julian listened, a slow smile spreading across his face. He wasn't just listening to a design pitch. He was listening to a philosophy. He was listening to the same intelligent compassion that had built a fortress in a little boy's mind, now preparing to build a sanctuary for an entire community. "I knew I chose the right architect," he said simply. Elara smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She thought back to the woman who had stood nervously before that cold, steel and glass mansion, clutching a secret journal. She had thought she was taking a step down, a step back. She had been wrong. It had been a necessary detour, a quiet period of observation that had reminded her of what was truly important. It wasn't the scale of the project or the prestige of the client. It was the integrity of the design. It was about building things that were strong, beautiful, and true, whether it was a skyscraper, a community, or a fortress in the mind of a lonely child. She reached into her bag and her fingers brushed against a small, smooth object. The seashell. A reminder that true worth is not in the gleaming, polished exterior, but in the intricate, resilient, and beautiful structure within. It was a lesson the Crofts had learned at a terrible cost, and a lesson she would now carry into every design she ever created. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and she breathed in the clean, salt air, feeling not like a victim who had been vindicated, but like a creator who had finally, truly, come home. The quiet before the storm had passed, the aftermath had settled, and now it was time to build. In the final resolution, the dust settled not into a landscape of revenge, but one of poetic justice and organic growth. Ilara's life, which had been put on a constrained, painful hold, blossomed with renewed purpose. The Oak Haven project became her magnum opus. She poured all her talent, her renewed energy, and the hard-won wisdom from her time with the Crofts into the work. She wasn't just designing landscapes, she was engineering communities. Her designs for Oak Haven won international acclaim before the first foundation was even poured, celebrated for their deep empathy and harmonious integration with nature. She became a leading voice in her field, a proponent of architecture that served humanity, not just capital. Her relationship with Julian Thorne evolved into a deep and respectful partnership. They were two people who understood the world in terms of structure, and they found in each other a rare intellectual and moral resonance. Their bond was built on shared principles and a mutual desire to build a better world, a foundation far stronger than any built on status or convenience. Richard Croft's journey was quieter, but no less profound. After the divorce, he sold his remaining shares in the diminished Croft Enterprises and moved to a small town to be closer to his son and his parents. He took a job as a high school business teacher, a position that brought him a fraction of his former income, but a wealth of personal satisfaction. He was, for the first time, contributing something real to the world. His relationship with Leo, once strained and distant, became the central pillar of his life. He was present, he was patient, and he was kind. He had lost an empire, but had found his soul. On occasion, he would send a short, formal email to Ilara's office, updating her on Leo's progress, a good report card, a new hobby, as if she were a silent shareholder in his son's well-being. Ilara would always reply with a brief, warm message of encouragement. There was no animosity, only the quiet acknowledgement of a debt that could never be fully repaid. Eleanor was the tragic figure in the tale. She never found her way back. Stripped of the wealth and status that had been her armor and her identity, she was left with only herself, and she did not like what she saw. She drifted, living off the settlement from her divorce, forever chasing a phantom of her former life. She would be spotted occasionally at lower-tier social events, her clothes a little dated, her expression a little too hungry. She became a cautionary tale whispered among the elite she had once ruled, a reminder that a life built on the humiliation of others is a structure with no foundation, destined to collapse. She never reached out to her son, her shame and pride forming an insurmountable wall. One crisp autumn afternoon, 2 years after she had left the estate, Ilara returned. The house had been sold to a young family who filled it with laughter and vibrant art. On a whim, she knocked on the door and asked if she might see the garden. The new owners, who knew of her work on Oak Haven, were thrilled to let her. She walked to the back of the property, to the forgotten corner behind the rhododendrons. The small, secret garden she and Leo had planted was still there. The new family had discovered it and, charmed by its simple, organic layout, had tended to it. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit, climbing the strong trellises they had built. The flowers were a riot of color, buzzing with bees. It had survived. It had thrived. She stood there for a long moment, thinking about the journey. It was a story about the triumph of integrity over arrogance, of course. But it was also about something more subtle. It was about the power of seeing things for what they truly are. The Crofts had looked at her and seen a nanny. Julian Thorne had looked at her and seen an architect. She had looked at a sterile lawn and seen a garden. She had looked at a frightened child and seen a hero in the making. True worth, she realized, wasn't just a hidden quality waiting to be revealed. It was an active way of seeing. It was the ability to look past the superficial labels and see the underlying structure, the potential for growth, the blueprint of the soul. That was the real power. Not wealth, not status, but vision. And with that final clarifying thought, she turned away from the garden, her heart full not of vindication, but of a deep and lasting peace. The past was a closed chapter, a foundation upon which a new, magnificent structure was being built. And the future was an open landscape waiting for her design. So, we come to the end of Alara's story. It's a powerful reminder that the way we treat people is a reflection of our own character, not theirs. And that true strength often lies not in what is displayed, but in what is quietly endured and cultivated. The world is full of people who are underestimated, who carry entire worlds of talent and grace within them, hidden from those who refuse to see. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Have you ever been in a situation where you were completely misjudged, only for the truth to come out in a surprising way? Share your story in the comments below. We can all learn from each other's experiences. Thank you for joining us for this journey. If you found this story of justice and redemption meaningful, please give it a like and consider subscribing to our channel for more content that celebrates the strength of the human spirit. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories. Until next time, remember to look for the hidden gardens in the world around you.